Yeah, as I said, my name is Patrick Watson. This keynote presentation was prepared by our Director of Research, Dominic Black. So if the presentation is bad, it's his fault. If it goes well, it's my fault. So we can attribute a blame and credit accordingly to that. So what we wanted to take you through was a bit of Cavell's research. We're coming up to lunch, so I'll whistle-stop tour. First of all, what was 2022 look like? I think we were all very optimistic about how it was going to go. Then what happened? There was a war in Europe and international supply chain issues and real problems. The graph on the left is business confidence in the OECD from January 2020. As you could see, it was rising post-pandemic. Everyone was very optimistic, as was I. And then various, macroeconomic, geopolitical factors have caused a real downturn in that. We also looked at inflation rates. I just thought I'd highlight that in the graph on the right. So in the dark column is January 2022, and in this sort of lovely mauve colour, that's December 2022. And as you can see, inflation rising dramatically pretty much everywhere in Europe, even Switzerland, which is notoriously resilient to this as sort of a neutral currency capital. In the US, we're seeing actually the inflation hasn't risen and the inflationary pressure isn't quite as much in the US, but it's definitely being felt in Europe. We did, myself and Katie, who was in the audience a minute ago, my colleague, we did interviews with over 50 service providers, and a lot of you noted that you were feeling inflationary pressure and customers were generally feeling some pressure from the economy. So 2022, a couple of major issues, as well as, and we talked about it, Matt mentioned it earlier on, industry layoffs. All of the panelists that I've just had on stage from some of the world's leading tech companies, big layoffs across the board. We've done, the bars are number of total layoffs, and the green, which is actually quite difficult to see on here, is proportion of total workforce. One thing I should say about this, there was a big boom in the employee bases of these organizations during the pandemic. So actually, when we did a little bit of analysis of the sort of bell curve you might expect, we're probably still above where you would expect the sort of company size basis to be. This effectively is a bit of a dip caused by global economic circumstances. Change in price of shares as well, as Matt mentioned, huge fall in valuations across the board caused by wider economic circumstances, and we've seen a sort of drive towards refocusing on profitability. So 2022, and these Dom's words, not the best. But we'll move on. What does the future look like? And this, I wanted to go through this quickly. I can spend a lot of time on this slide, but I am hungry. The few sort of foundational impacts that we're looking at from a Cavell perspective. First of all, environmental circumstances. I think regularly, and I'm always skeptical on this, when we do enterprise surveys, we ask people what's important when you're buying for a company, and it comes back, oh, they're green credentials. And I think, really? Are you telling the truth? How much do you weight that against price? But I think from a foundational impact perspective, general environmental circumstances are much more of an influence than they were previously. Macroeconomic, as I've just talked about previously, it massively impacts the market in various different ways. Globalization, connectivity, you're no longer competing with the provider that is 10 miles down the road from you, you're competing with one based in California with a head office. These factors massively influence core markets, emerging technology trends, and industry responses. And finally, and just a little plug, immediately after lunch, my colleagues, Katie and Caitlin, we've commissioned some research from 2,000 technology users about the sort of generational preferences for communication technology, and there's some really interesting stuff in there. So just after lunch, they'll take you through that. But it's often overlooked, this changing generational dynamic of who's in the workforce and how they want to communicate, and ultimately how that's going to impact provision of services from service providers and telcos. So effectively, those foundational impacts iterate across several different areas. So improved connectivity, the move to cloud, some things we're seeing in the core market. Mark mentioned mobile-centric, which is obviously key. We talked about UX, UI in the previous panel, the importance of collaboration, again, the hyperscalers in communications, and that focus on customer engagement, which I think was a regular comment during that collaboration panel, that customer experience and contact center is going to be key. What have we seen from the industry? And Matt talked about a lot of these earlier. The demand for full stack across not just comms, but you're going to have to widen out your offering across IT and potentially other areas as well. We've seen the consolidation of platforms, and we're seeing that in a lot of markets in terms of merger and acquisition, race for scale to enable competition with some of those hyperscale providers, the growth in the as-a-service model, which I think is a result of that move towards cloud, and indirect channel convergence. So these are just, what we were trying to map is what's causing some of these impacts that we're seeing further down the line. What's causing some of the reactions that we're seeing in the industry? So that was just for that. To Mark's presentation previously, what we tried to map, this is the Western European cloud communications market. So the bars are the total number of users up until 2027. But what we've tried to do is categorize those by the types of user they are, because historically, Cavell, we would categorize a UC user, a fixed line, in all of the categories. But actually, there's what we might call a standard voice cloud comms user, which exactly what I said would be fixed line, and then collaboration enabled, which is maybe they're using Zoom, maybe they're using Microsoft Teams, and they're using Zoom Phone, or they're using Teams telephony. And then final, mobile enabled cloud users. And that comes back to Mark's point about FMC before, being focused on that mobile centric. So that was just a division that we've tried to make a bit more detail in the sort of forecast and how we break down a basic UC user. In terms of markets, I would have looked at penetration. The dark graph is penetration at the moment. The light green column is penetration in 2027, and we are going to reach pretty high saturation of cloud communications into the overall telephony base. So that's what we're looking at here. Cloud communications into the overall telephony base. Above 80% in particularly developed markets. The US, Netherlands, UK will exceed that as well by 2027. One thing to mention here as well, I think is key, is that some of these markets, there's a lot more opportunity for growth because of the size of the markets, but also their particular, and you look at France and Germany at the back, generally reticent to cloud-based technologies. We've actually seen anecdotally a bit of that changing, so it'll be interesting to see how that develops and how that provides opportunity for service providers. Looked across, this is the entirety of Western Europe across segments, so organisations of different sizes, and traditionally we've seen a bit the middle market, mainly driven by Germany, which is the Mittelstand is a large proportion of the users, a sort of reticence to move towards cloud. We do see that changing, actually. I think some of the solutions out there are much more catered for that middle market, and I think we'll see that rising. So we're going to see the penetration across all market segments rise significantly. And again, this is up to 2027 here. I just haven't put the dates on the slide. I just noticed in Matt's keynote, he actually took the headlines of this for his own. And I don't know where he got the idea from that from, but I will be telling Dom. So this is from our enterprise research, which was more than 2,000 businesses across Western Europe and the US. And we asked them, what are their communication priorities for the next 3 years? And I've segmented this by market size. And I think better customer services comes across massively in small and medium business. And I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's particularly interesting in terms of contact centres have generally been very much confined to the enterprise, but we're actually seeing demand for that come down a lot in size. And I think that demand for contact centre-like solutions to improve reputation is going to be a key focus. For the larger enterprise, I think, and it was Chris on the previous, better analytics is absolutely key. We actually did a study of the analytics capabilities of UC. It's a real focus for large enterprises, especially with more diverse work from anywhere workforces, actually being able to monitor productivity and what people are doing. And interestingly, we saw a real rise in sort of soft side analytics, how are users behaving, how happy they are in their roles. That's a really key focus. This slide I really like, can't take any credit for this. So what we've got here is the net change in threat perception. So this comes from a study we did of about 50 to 100 service providers, and the dark green is threat perception now. What percentage of service providers see that particular dynamic as a threat, and then the blue is in 3 years' time. So as you can see, The service providers that we spoke to currently see their local competition as the biggest threat now, but in 3 years they see that dropping significantly. Microsoft, considered a key threat by 50% of organizations now, that's increasing to more than 70% in the future. So I think that's really interesting in terms of how the service providers and telcos globally sort of perceive the different threats coming from the market. And I talked about it in that first slide with the sort of macro trends in terms of that changing competitive landscape. One other thing I will highlight in here as well, Avaya and Mitel. Not seen as a threat by anyone now, not seen as a threat by anyone in the future. So that isn't a joke. I think previously they would have been seen as hugely competitive from service providers and telcos, and it's not the case anymore. So I think that's just something to bear in mind. I thought, following the threat perception of Microsoft, I could talk about my area of focus here at Cavell, which is Microsoft Teams. This is our telephony enablement data across Western Europe. And I was having a good discussion out for dinner last night with a number of you who are here today about forecasting 5 years out. These are our forecasts. We have a very advanced data model that we feed data from you, from the industry. Dom and I don't throw darts at a board until we hit this. This comes back with feedback from the industry. You give us numbers anonymously. We put it into the data model, and it creates a forecast. Now, forecasting 5 years out, nobody was forecasting a pandemic. Nobody, I don't think, was forecasting a war in Ukraine. The geopolitical solution in US and China doesn't look great at the moment. That's a little, So forecasting 5 years out, there are an incredible number of variables that can impact this. But this is what the forecast looks at the moment. So Microsoft growing to more than 18 million telephony-enabled users in Western Europe alone by 2027. I have also split these by enablement method. At the moment, the vast majority of users, obviously deployed via direct routing. We do see Operator Connect as Microsoft's preferred method going forward. We've actually dialed back the forecast slightly because some of the feedback we've had from service providers and telcos, but in the long run, we do think Operator Connect will be the more popular enablement method. Teams Phone Mobile, which Dan from Pinco and Mark discussed this morning, is the real unknown in the room. It's only live with a few providers globally at the moment. We haven't had the feedback on how much traction it's going to get. It's really interesting to see how that grows from, as Mark was saying, FMC solutions aren't new, but it's really interesting to see how that's going to impact the market. And to the points that Matt was making this morning, this again is from our study, and we asked service providers what areas they're focusing in. And I think that race to scale point in terms of acquisition of other service providers is key. Addressing new vertical market segments, Magnus, to your point previously, that vertical focus is obviously key, and a lot of people seeing that as a real opportunity for business. We're seeing less focus on launching into new geographic territories, and maybe, Mehmet, that comes back to your point on regulation and how complex that is potentially as well, that people are not focusing on that area. One area we have seen a rise across the board is security. More focus on security, and I think a lot of the providers in this room I've spoken to about that. So what does this mean for service providers? And again, we had the discussion of this last night. There are market opportunities, but the reaction speed has to be quick in order to leverage those opportunities within the market. I don't think the potentially 3-year development cycle is viable anymore, especially from a product platform stack. You need to be able to react quickly and address market trends, which are very dynamic. The second point is as relevant for Cavell as it is for everyone else in the audience, that these markets, as I showed on the previous slide with penetrations, are going to be reaching high levels of saturation by 2025 and onwards. Where does the opportunity come from then? Is it migrating from other players? From Cavell's perspective, our research, our cloud communications market reports talk about this. Are you all going to buy research from us for me to tell you that a market is 90% penetrated? Probably not. So we are diversifying our offering, and I'll come on to that in a few minutes, but I think we all need to realise that this is a market that is reaching high levels of saturation, particularly in the US and Western Europe. That competitive landscape is changing and is disrupting, and again, I think that goes back to the speed of reaction. And finally, I think, and this was discussed at length earlier on in Matt's panel, about looking at new and additional revenue streams. And I think that's absolutely vital for service providers. The margin revenue models have changed, and generating area in revenue and margin in areas outside of base telephony is obviously key. So how are Cavell helping? This is what our research package looks like now. We cover contact center, Microsoft Teams, cloud networks, telecoms buyers. These are enterprise studies. And also our cloud comms market reports, which cover in detail 14 markets geographically. The Channel Insight program, I think, is particularly interesting. And this is, Tom's even put a little video in, that's really fancy. So anyone who hasn't seen this, we're demoing it outside, and effectively we have utilized our in-house data science team to develop a tool that effectively uses HTML scraping technology to pull data on the channel market. So currently we cover in English-speaking regions, because obviously there's a language dependency there, 36,000, Katie, I think I'm right, providers across the US, English-speaking markets, Australia, and we can look at what vendors they sell, what products they talk about on their website, how big they are, what their locations are. So if you are looking at a channel go-to-market strategy, or you want to know who all your competitors are and what they're selling, or you're a vendor and you want to know what your partners are selling from a competitive standpoint, I think this is something you should be exploring. Naturally, I'm going to plug it as much as possible, but we are demoing it out there if anyone wants to come and take a look at that. And just last slide, Cavell, I'm really proud since joining of the amount of organisations that we do business with. A lot of you in this room today, we provide research and consultancy services to everyone you see here. So I think from a Cavell perspective and an independent standpoint, if you're looking for research on cloud communications or any of those areas I talked about previously, please do get in touch, because the vast majority of the industry is utilising Cavell. So without further ado, it is lunchtime, so I will let you all go. I have been advised, just a little tip, if you go out that door and round that corner, there's more food in that area. So I was recommended to tell everyone to exit that way. I don't know whether this is true. It's up to you whether you believe me or not. But it is lunchtime. As I said, we'll be back in about an hour, but we'll call you in on the tannoy. And there's a really good session on the generational dynamics, so don't miss that. But thank you all for your time. Much appreciated.